This is about comparative survey data files in GESIS and what you as a potential user could expect of these files. We thought we would conclude the current series of the experts event with this topic because we have had a number of talks actually about different aspects of data harmonization, actually not only survey data harmonization. And the part that was missing still was a bit of an overview of what kind of harmonized data we have available in GESIS and what you as a user that's perhaps new to this could expect of these things that we can offer in this regard. So it will be very practical, what I will be talking about here. I will start with a brief section on what we mean by data harmonization and why it's a good thing, and perhaps useful distinction between first and second tier harmonization steps, but that's only for terminological order. Very briefly show give you a few hints at how to get harmonized data at GESIS, show a few examples of what you can expect to find, list a few of the challenges from our experience, and then give you a few examples in more depth to flesh out the part on the challenges. So this will not be very analytical, in contrast to some other presentations you have seen, but it will be a bit of storytelling, and the intention is to give you a feeling of how you should probably handle these data, and perhaps also maybe give you an idea of how you could approach your own harmonization projects if you have such intentions. Anyway, let's start with the real stuff. With data harmonization, we have a conventional distinction between ex-ante harmonization of data, which happens if we design our measurement in advance before collecting the data in a way that we can expect maximum equivalence, even if we have some reasons to expect that the measurement process might give different results for different sections of the population we are sampling from or that we are trying to observe. And that's the classical case of like trying to match questionnaires across languages if we do cross-national surveys. So the big comparative survey programs run extensive methods experiments on making questions in different languages as comparable as possible, for example. In contrast to that, we have ex-post harmonization, which is in very generic terms the types of harmonization that we need to apply to data from different sources, where ex-ante harmonization wasn't in place or hasn't fully worked out. So there's something left to desire in terms of the equivalence from the data between the data sources and the measures we get from them. In terms of representational measurement theory, we try to remove any differences among segments of the data where the observed numerical relational structure doesn't fully match to the intended empirical relational structure that we want to measure, really, that we want to describe. We are using this generic definition of harmonization because, as you will see, there are so many things that might play into this thing. It's a bit more than conventional measurement, psychometric measurement theory that's at work here. And with different sources, we mean anything that segments the measurement process in a way that we can perhaps expect systematically different results, different populations that we try to measure, different samples, or we use different instruments for the same construct, or basically anything else what could constitute outcome differences. And now we come to that less familiar term, the second tier harmonization, which I basically invented especially for this presentation. This is a very practical thing. We have harmonization going on in all these comparative settings as a routine thing, ex ante and ex post harmonization. One thing that's increasingly happening is that harmonized data, for example, data from survey programs such as the European Value Study and the International Social Survey Program, that these are taken up and that researchers try to combine these for particular purposes. And then we have a new layer of harmonization, and that's what I call second tier harmonization. Just for being able to describe the stages in these processes. Why is harmonization so useful? Because we can use harmonized data, of course, to do things that we couldn't do without them. The first routine application with surveys that we are aware of, most of us certainly, is the case of cross-national comparison, where we have both ex ante and ex post harmonization approaches in place. If we go away from the cross-national perspective, we have and want to assess the same population at the same point in time, we can use harmonization from data sets with different samples, by pooling them together, so we increase sample sizes, which can be useful for observing small groups, for example, that wouldn't otherwise have enough statistical power. And if we go to the across time perspective, then it's of course trend analysis, where we very often combine different samples in one data set for time series cross-sectional research designs. And the second tier would be if we move on to comparative cross-national trend analysis. That usually implies that we combine data sets that already have been harmonized in the first stage, or that we combine data from different survey programs, which then often employ slightly different instruments for similar or same constructs. That's something that we do to increase the regional or temporal coverage. If, for example, the International Survey Program has surveyed a particular country at a given time, which the World Value Survey hasn't surveyed, or the other way around. And for certain applications, it can be useful to combine these data for aggregate estimates, for example. And finally, we have the application of harmonization processes wherein we link macro data sources like official statistics among themselves, or with survey data again to arrive at multi-level data sets. Good. What do we have at GESIS? It's actually not that easy to find because we don't have like the data set description keyword harmonized data. But we do have increasingly powerful search tool in place, which gives you filtering options. And you could go, if you want to look at any of these cross-national or time comparative data, you can go by the geography or the temporal research design filters that will give you some indication what kind of data collection was behind these. And as a subset of these, you might sometimes find harmonized data sets, especially also second-tier harmonized data sets. But there's no systematic search option for these kind of things yet. And maybe it isn't necessary also because the curated collections that we have at GESIS, such as the Albus for the electoral studies programs that we run in intensive curation, very often have their own harmonization support offers for linkage or for accumulating data sets, etc. I will mention a few of these in a minute. And on top of that, we have some projects that actually deal with harmonization as such. I will also name these. And beyond that, you might have suspected this, there is an overarching activity evolving at GESIS under the guidance of my colleague Ranjit Singh at the Survey Data Method department, where we are creating a web page that will also provide a bit of an overview of the harmonized data and the methodological work we are doing there. And the links I'm giving here will also be made available later with a YouTube video. So you have stuff to click on. Examples, what could be found? I will be very quick with these. For example, for the ALBUS, the General Social Survey, there's a series of accumulations across time, which yields a ready-to-use data set. And with most new waivers, this is being extended with the fresh data at the national level. Similar for the Politbarometer, they are compiled across the monthly samples to year-wise samples, and then there's a long-term trend file covering many, many years actually already. Similarly for the election survey program, the GLAS, that hasn't been running for that long, they also have accumulation file. And in the national surveys area, we already have the second tier approach in place as well, where we are linking across different survey programs. That's a project run by Ranjit Singh again, and he has already made a detailed presentation on that, which you will then find in the YouTube series from the under the Meet the Experts header, which is linking instruments, especially single item instruments across different German survey programs for the same concept. And related finally at the national level, we also have the MISI platform, which is offering official statistics metadata in this case, and providing scripts to work with those. But they have also created a micro census, official statistics census trend file as a accumulation exercise. For the international scope, the programs usually that we host here, ISSP, EVS, Comparative Study of Electoral Systems, also have their own accumulated dataset offers in different forms, adapting to the conditions of these survey programs. And I'm just quoting the links here for you to check. One thing that's worth mentioning probably is the CSES accumulation, which is relatively recent, hasn't been around forever, which also now have a long-term accumulation over time amongst the different 5, or is it 4 in that case, CSES modules. What commonalities do we have and what differences among these data projects? Many of these produce ready-made data sets, but not all do. Especially the second-tier projects pretty often prefer to provide harmonization scripts instead of a complete data set, which then implies that the data users have to download the source data sets that are to be combined into accumulated harmonized file on their own, store them on the local hard disk, and then run the provided scripts over these to create the final harmonized data set, which would then be used for further analysis. The reason behind that very often is intellectual property rights on the core source data sets, which not always are only with GESIS, so we cannot ad libitum transfer them into something else. But sometimes also practical considerations, because it's easier to adapt for version updates in the source data with this kind of approach. If we do our harmonization work, we have usually a focus on usability and completeness of documentation and creating transparency, which I think is something we do comparatively good in comparison to like the ad hoc research projects that employ harmonization processes out there. Especially if we look at the how we work with categorical variables and linkage keys towards overarching units. For example, if you think about country codes, then those would usually be standardized towards an ISO international standard or this or that kind. Or not. We try to employ political party classifications for the political science data and that kind of stuff. What we do to a lesser extent or not at all is employ advanced harmonization methodology on quantitative measures. And that's important to know because you could understand harmonization to mean that we try to optimize the measurement towards equivalence by looking at estimation processes, like again, Ranjit Singh has been employing with an equating approach. That's not what usually happens in the data we provide, but it's more at the range of harmonizing scales in a very technical sense, adapting codings and ranges, etc. That's also where sometimes the challenges lie if we look at these data, and we will come to some of these in a minute. The thing that most people probably think about if they talk about harmonization, ex post harmonization of data, is that scales, response scales to questionnaire instruments need to be normalized and standardized to common ranges and units, so that the reported response behavior becomes comparable in a technical sense. One step further is the question of actual equivalence at the latent construct level behind these, where we also talk about comparing reliability and validity of these things and testing these. That is the kind of analysis that you can usually do with multi-item instruments, and we could employ structural equation methodology to estimate latent scores, for example, after testing that there is a degree of equivalence across the different sources, etc. And that's the areas where a lot of methodological work actually exists in a conventional sense. But what we see in terms of challenges, at least as often, if not more, and with sometimes probably even higher relevance, are well, things that we would usually describe as errors or mistakes in the data of some kind. We have errors in instrument application at the source already. We have coding errors in the processing of the data. They can exist in the source data, and they can also exist in the harmonized data sets, actually. So stuff that we do incorrectly, that does happen, of course. And at the study or survey level, there are probably even more items of things that can be problematic in a slightly hidden way. Very often we have variation across sources in the different regions of the population that is being measured. For example, cross-national survey programs run in countries like Britain sometimes include Northern Ireland, sometimes they don't, and that is just local convenience. Most non-British people wouldn't pay attention to that, but of course it plays a role in what you get. Then we have variation and sampling frames or designs that are usually, descriptions of which are usually hidden deep in methodology reports, which you never look at basically if you look at harmonized data sets, because that's done for the original national source sample. We have variations in data collection timing, especially relevant for the second tier harmonization. I will show an example of that later. We might have other hidden quality differences in the data collection processes, something that is perhaps known as house effect, where we know that different survey agencies produce different results across their samples, etc. And we have in the resulting data sets like different availability of paradata or methodological information such as weight variables, which may be provided by one survey program but in different ways by another survey program. And this is of course all relevant for the analysis but hard to merge if at all possible. This is all made worse very often by documentation gaps. Even if you look for these things, you are not always able to find it. And again, it is not easy to treat in a clean methodological way, because all these things are terribly difficult to quantify and assess in anything else but qualitative ways. So you just have to be on your toes to look out for these things and don't have standard methodology to deal with this. Two examples to show a bit of this, or maybe only one, looking at the time. I will briefly talk then to conclude about something we did with the European Values Study trend file and the World Values Survey trend file, which are being integrated into something that we call the Integrated Values Surveys. And if I have time, I will also show something else, but let's look for that later. So for EVS and WVS in brief, you know probably that these have been very long-running survey programs starting in 1981. And they have been regularly conducted since until now in different time intervals for each of the two. But for now, we have 5 EVS waves and 7 WVS waves. And both have produced their own trend files. And they have a lot of commonality in their questionnaires, but not entirely. And sometimes they have tiny differences which need to be paid attention to. So we start for each of these programs from the cross-sectional comparative data sets that are produced for each campaign. Those are then cumulated, again separately for each program, into trend files. And the last step that we conduct for these is that we merge these trend files towards something that is analysis ready, which then gives a very good coverage actually in survey data of many countries of the world. The time span is 1981 to 2022 actually, because the 27 is only nominal title. Surveys have been conducted until very recently in both programs. There are more than 120 countries and more than 420 country year cells covered by both together. That is, of course, the reason why these need to be merged. They increase regional and temporal coverage if they are combined, because the focus of the European Value Study is, of course, only on Europe, whereas the World Values Survey basically focuses on countries outside Europe, with a few exceptions. And that is results in a pretty big file with more than 800 variables and 660,000 interviews. A few examples of the problems you need to deal with when merging these things. We have extremely similar questions here, for example, taken from the most recent waves here. This is about potential value change and the assessment of that. And what you see as two things basically. EVS has 2 items on this, WVS has 3. That might have methods effects by question neighborhood. But the more important thing is that the response options, although they have the same verbal anchors, are not presented in the same sequence to the respondents. What can we do with that? Well, as I said, we don't go very deeply into methodological considerations here. We very often take a simple approach. So in this case, we just recoded the EVS variable towards the WVS pattern and moved the don't mind response to the center of the scale and arrive at a common variable that is consistently harmonized. And any methods of effects of that would need to be explored by a data user who needs to be aware that something like this has happened. It could have methods effects. We haven't checked, actually, to be very honest, not at a very deep level, beyond looking at distributions. Another example of a similar kind about priorities for having a job in terms of jobs being scarce to people. Men should have more right to jobs than women. That's a very established value or attitude assessment item that has been run across most of the waves for both survey programs. And both used to run it in a 3-point scale format, then switched to 5-point scales. But accidentally, not all WVS countries made that switch. So the resolution is that in that case, we offer both versions, a recoded 3-point scale for the cases where no 3-point scale was originally used to create consistency across time and across countries. Surface consistency, we need to say, and the 5-point scale version where it was collected. So users, again, can make their own decisions and comparisons for this. Another example, looking at the study level this time. This is a table that relates only to EVS 2017 or Wave 5 and WVS Wave 7, the latest wave of WVS that is. And here we have the case that despite the division of work between the two programs, we have some countries where both programs fielded their own surveys, sometimes in cooperation, sometimes not. And this has, of course, consequences at the study level. The first thing you need to pay attention to is that these have been fielded at different times, which is a good thing probably in many cases. But the point is that this is not always easily noticed if you just go by the wave markers. And many people do that as a matter of convenience to see what was run in parallel in terms of time. So the first big thing to always look at the fieldwork periods of surveys in these huge cumulated files. It's surprisingly easy to miss. The second thing is then that you can, of course, have changes, meaningful changes between these data collection events in the same country. And that can be a good or a bad thing, depending on what you want to do. For example, for Armenia, data will not be very easily compared because the society experienced a war between these two data collection events and also COVID, which may have effects as well. The COVID effect would be in other countries, like for Great Britain. We have also had Brexit as a non-trivial event between the collection waves. And again, depending on what you want to do, this can be a good or a bad thing. You can use this sometimes as a condition for a natural experiment, of course, that has been done with the COVID data. But you need to be aware of these things. That's the important thing. And there are also methods differences, which are not always easily obvious between these surveys. So we have mode differences even within samples that can have mostly smaller methodological effects. But we also have actually hidden population differences here. In that case, where the EVS rules mandate that for Slovakia, a Hungarian language version is fielded because the threshold for having a language adapted version is at 5%, I believe, for the EVS. So the Hungarian minority in Slovakia gets their own questionnaire, but the threshold is 10% or something else for WVS, and so they don't get their own questionnaire version and are less well covered in that sense, and that might be relevant. Anyway, in a technical sense, before I conclude here, I just wanted to show you some brief thing really that gives you an idea of how much heterogeneity sits at which level of these files. Just for the sake of the thought experiment here, we have counted the effort that we invested into curating and harmonizing the national samples for the EVS 2017 files, then moving on to a joint file, cross-sectional file, for both survey programs, and then combining these survey programs with their trend files, that's not a linear workflow actually here, into something that is really the big thing that I just described. And the number of countries and samples, of course, increases across these steps, but the number of codes we employ in scripts, processing scripts on doing this decreases drastically, which means that we are, of course, reducing the heterogeneity in the source data step by step. But the question is how much of it goes away really, or is just hidden. I will leave that for you to decide when you work with the data. But it's probably illustrative of what you have to expect depending on where you start with your own harmonization effort, if you ever embark on such a project. I will then skip the second example and just show you the outcome that you could potentially get after all this harmonization work. This is a very simple analysis conducted on the integrated value survey, which is just comparing country means for happiness and health, both as satisfaction with health and general happiness in life, from the combined EVS and WVS trend files, the integrated value survey. And you see that those are to a degree consistent even without doing anything, and the amount of work after having that integrated file that you need to produce this file is just a few lines of R code that you see on the left hand here. It's not even 14 lines that you needed to apply to get this kind of graph. Further analysis, of course, pending. We don't have any methods controls done for this yet, and you can see perhaps that their trends are not, visually speaking, perhaps not exactly the same in both samples, but overall the picture is similar to a degree. Okay, I will leave it at that and skip the second example and come to my take-home message. Read the frigging manual if you work with the harmonized data to to the tiniest detail because it could be relevant.